Good evening, generals, and welcome once again to Men Around the Führer series. Nuremberg, 1947. A man sits in the defendant's chair, immaculately dressed despite 18 months of imprisonment. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, the second most powerful figure in the German Air Force, the architect of industrial miracles, the man who built wings for an empire, now faces a different kind of scrutiny. The prosecutor holds up a document. It details the use of concentration camp prisoners in aircraft factories, 12,000 dead from starvation and brutality. Milch's signature appears at the bottom. He doesn't flinch. Instead, he does what he's always done. He lies. "I never saw such conditions," he testifies. "I was not responsible for labor allocation." But the paper trail tells a different story. A story of a man who spent 20 years building an illusion of competence, while bodies piled up in his shadow. A man who clawed his way to the top through deception, backstabbing, and industrial-scale fraud. A man who convinced everyone, including himself, that he was indispensable. He was the general who couldn't fly, the aviation expert who understood nothing about aircraft design, the logistics genius who couldn't deliver a single jet fighter when it mattered most. This is the story of how Erhard Milch built an empire on lies, and how those lies finally consumed him. To understand Milch, you need to understand the central fraud of his existence. Erhard Milch wasn't supposed to exist in the upper echelons of the regime. Under the racial laws that defined Berlin's hierarchy, he was legally classified as half-Jewish. His father was Anton Milch, a Jewish pharmacist. This fact alone should have destroyed his career before it began. But Milch had something the regime needed: organizational ability, and more importantly, he had ruthlessness. When questions arose about his ancestry in 1935, Milch engineered one of the most cynical solutions in the regime's history. He convinced his elderly mother to sign a legal document swearing that Anton Milch wasn't his real father, that she'd had an affair with her uncle, Baron Hermann von Beer. The document was a fabrication. Everyone knew it was a fabrication, but the leader personally declared Milch Aryan anyway. He needed him. This wasn't mercy. It was leverage. Milch now owed everything to the system. His entire existence depended on remaining useful, and that dependency made him more fanatical, more brutal, more willing to do the unspeakable than almost anyone else in the inner circle. Before the regime took power, Milch had been working at Lufthansa, the civilian airline. He was a World War I artillery officer who'd never flown a combat mission, but had transferred to aviation administration. He understood schedules, logistics, bureaucracy. He made things run efficiently. Hermann Göring noticed him, and in 1933, Milch became State Secretary of the Air Ministry, effectively the operational commander of the entire Air Force, while Göring played dress-up and collected art. Milch's job was simple: build an air force from nothing, and do it in secret, violating every clause of the Versailles Treaty. He was brilliant at it, and that brilliance became his prison. Between 1933 and 1939, Milch built what appeared to be the most powerful air force in the world. He established aircraft production lines. He created training schools. He forged alliances with industry leaders. He requisitioned factories. He hired designers. The numbers looked spectacular on paper. Production charts showed exponential growth. The propaganda machine celebrated the invincible armada. But beneath the surface, the cracks were already forming. Milch was an administrator, not an engineer. He didn't understand the technical limitations of aircraft design. He made production quotas based on wishful thinking rather than industrial capacity. He promised delivery dates that were physically impossible. He created a system where factory managers learned to inflate their numbers because honesty meant punishment. Everyone lied to Milch, and Milch lied to Göring, and Göring lied to the leader. The entire apparatus ran on systematic fraud. When the war began in 1939, the Air Force had approximately 4,000 aircraft. Impressive, but the training pipeline was shallow. Spare parts were insufficient. Fuel reserves were limited. The entire structure was optimized for short, decisive campaigns, knockout punches that would end before the illusion collapsed. Poland fell in weeks. France in months. The system seemed to work. Then came Britain. The Battle of Britain was Milch's first real test, and he failed it completely. The Air Force couldn't sustain losses. Pilot training took months, but Milch's schools were producing aviators in weeks. Aircraft production couldn't replace combat attrition. The logistics network couldn't support operations across the channel. Göring blamed the pilots. Milch blamed the factories. The factories blamed supply shortages. Everyone pointed fingers while the casualty reports mounted. But the real problem was structural. The Air Force had been built for theater, not for war. It looked powerful. It wasn't. Milch's response was Dian Xing Day. He demanded higher production quotas. He screamed at factory managers. He threatened engineers. He reorganized the bureaucracy. He created new committees. He held more meetings. None of it addressed the fundamental issue. They were building the wrong aircraft, training pilots inadequately, and operating under a strategic doctrine that made no sense. But Milch couldn't admit this. His entire position depended on being the man who made the impossible happen. So he kept promising miracles and delivering disasters. And then came Russia. Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941. The Air Force annihilated Soviet aviation in the first days. Thousands of aircraft destroyed on the ground. It looked like another triumph. Then winter arrived. Aircraft engines froze. Landing gear collapsed in mud. Fuel lines cracked in sub-zero temperatures. The entire logistical network disintegrated. Air bases were hundreds of miles behind the advancing army, making support impossible. Milch toured the Eastern Front in December 1941 and was horrified by what he saw. Pilots flying 3, 4, 5 missions per day. Mechanics working in open air at -30 degrees. Aircraft being cannibalized for parts. Crews sleeping in their cockpits because there were no barracks. He returned to Berlin and did what he always did. He reorganized the administration. He created the Milch Production Program, a scheme to triple aircraft output by 1943. He held rallies with factory workers. He gave speeches about will and determination. He threatened plant managers with execution for sabotage if they missed quotas. Production numbers on paper increased. Quality collapsed. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines with faulty engines. Electrical systems failed mid-flight. Fuel tanks leaked. Wings separated during stress maneuvers. The rush to meet Milch's impossible quotas meant corners were cut, inspections skipped, testing abbreviated. Pilots died, not from enemy fire, but from mechanical failure, and Milch blamed everyone except himself. But Milch's real enemies weren't in Moscow or London. They were in Berlin. His primary rival was Ernst Udet, the World War I flying ace who served as Director General of Equipment. Udet was a pilot. Milch was a bureaucrat. Udet understood aircraft. Milch understood paperwork. They hated each other. Udet saw Milch as a desk-bound fraud who'd never flown combat. Milch saw Udet as a drunken has-been living on past glory. Their feuding paralyzed decision-making. Programs were approved, canceled, reapproved based on whose meeting happened last. The dive bomber versus horizontal bomber debate consumed years. Fighter specifications changed monthly. The jet fighter program was delayed, accelerated, defunded, refunded in bureaucratic chaos. In November 1941, Udet committed suicide. He left a note blaming Göring and the Jew Milch for destroying the Air Force. Milch inherited Udet's position. He now controlled both production and equipment. Total authority. It should have been his moment of triumph. Instead, it became his crucible. Because now there was nobody left to blame. In February 1942, Albert Speer became armaments minister. Young, energetic, the leader's favorite architect, he immediately began centralizing industrial control. Milch saw him as an existential threat. For years, Milch had controlled aircraft production independently. Now, Speer wanted integration. Tanks, aircraft, weapons, all under one umbrella. Rational, efficient, sensible. Milch fought him with everything he had. The battle wasn't about policy. It was about ego. Milch had spent a decade building his power base. He wasn't going to surrender it to an architect half his age. They clashed in meetings. They sent dueling memos to the leadership. They sabotaged each other's initiatives. Milch would approve a factory allocation. Speer would redirect it to tank production. Speer would assign labor to artillery. Milch would claim those workers for aircraft plants. The leader often sided with Speer. Speer was charming, modern, optimistic. Milch was abrasive, bureaucratic, demanding. But Milch had one weapon Speer couldn't match. He was willing to use slave labor on a scale that shocked even the regime's standards. By 1943, German industry faced a critical labor shortage. Millions of men were at the front. Factories were desperate for workers. Milch's solution was concentration camp prisoners. He didn't stumble into this reluctantly. He embraced it. In a meeting with SS leadership in May 1943, Milch explicitly demanded access to camp populations. He toured Mauthausen concentration camp personally, evaluating prisoners for industrial work. His calculus was simple. Prisoners were expendable. If they died, more would arrive. Production quotas mattered more than lives. Underground factory complexes were built using camp labor. The most infamous was Mittelbau-Dora, where V-2 rockets were produced. Prisoners worked 16-hour shifts in unventilated tunnels. Thousands died from exhaustion, starvation, and brutality. Milch visited these facilities. He saw the conditions. He signed off on continued operations. When managers reported high death rates, Milch's response was to demand faster production schedules. When engineers warned about quality problems from exhausted workers, he threatened them with replacement. He wasn't ignorant. He wasn't deceived. He knew exactly what was happening, and he accelerated it. This wasn't the banality of evil. This was enthusiastic participation. By late 1943, it was obvious the Air Force was losing the technological war. Allied bombers were decimating German cities. Fighters couldn't intercept high-altitude formations effectively. The solution existed: the Me-262 jet fighter, fast enough to catch bombers, advanced enough to change the air war. Milch pushed hard for its production. This should have been his redemption, the moment where his organizational genius delivered a war-winning weapon. Instead, it became a catastrophic failure of bureaucracy and ego. The leader wanted the Me-262 converted into a fighter bomber. Milch wanted it as a pure interceptor. They argued for months while the design remained in flux. Engineers couldn't finalize specifications because the mission kept changing. Then came engine problems. The jet turbines had a 25-hour lifespan. They required rare metals. Manufacturing tolerances were incredibly tight. Milch demanded mass production anyway. He set quotas of hundreds per month. Engineers protested that the engines weren't ready. Milch accused them of defeatism. The Me-262 entered service in July 1944, 2 years after it could have. By then, Allied air supremacy was absolute. The few jets that flew were often destroyed on the ground. Fuel shortages meant many never left their hangars. The miracle weapon arrived too late because Milch couldn't navigate the bureaucratic warfare he'd spent 20 years creating. By January 1945, the fantasy was over. Allied armies were crossing into Germany from east and west. Cities were rubble. Factories were destroyed. The Air Force barely existed. Milch still held meetings. He still issued directives. He still demanded production reports from factories that no longer existed. In his final months of power, he was a ghost issuing orders to phantoms. Göring had long since retreated into drug addiction and delusion. The leader was in his bunker, issuing orders to armies that had ceased to exist, and Milch was in his office, moving pieces on a map of an empire that had already fallen. On April 27, 1945, Milch drafted a memo about reorganizing aircraft production for the second quarter. 3 days later, the leader committed suicide. Milch was captured by British forces in May. He was polite, cooperative, helpful. He offered his expertise to the Allies. He explained organizational structures. He provided intelligence on Soviet capabilities. He genuinely seemed to believe he'd be useful to the victors. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945. Göring was in the dock. So were Speer, Jodl, Keitel, Ribbentrop, the architects of the regime. Milch expected to testify as a witness, not a defendant. After all, he was just an administrator. He'd built factories, organized logistics, pushed paperwork. Then the prosecution discovered the paper trail. Memos in Milch's handwriting requesting concentration camp labor. His signature on documents authorizing expanded use of prisoners. Testimony from survivors describing his personal inspections of underground factories. In January 1947, Milch faced his own trial for war crimes. The prosecution was methodical. They presented document after document, witness after witness. The evidence was overwhelming. Milch's defense was surreal. He claimed he didn't know about conditions in the camps. He said he thought prisoners were volunteers. He insisted he was just following orders from Göring and Speer. None of it was credible. His own memos contradicted every claim. On April 16, 1947, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He served 9 years. In 1954, he was released as part of a general amnesty for war criminals. He was 59 years old. Milch lived another 18 years in comfortable obscurity in Düsseldorf. He never expressed remorse. In interviews, he defended the regime's industrial policies. He praised the efficiency of centralized planning. He blamed the Allies for prosecuting administrators instead of understanding the complexities of wartime production. He wrote memoirs justifying his decisions. He consulted for aerospace companies. He gave lectures on management theory. He died in 1972 at age 77, wealthy and unrepentant. So what was Erhard Milch? He was the face of technocratic evil. The man who proved that you don't need ideology to commit atrocities, just ambition, efficiency, and a willingness to treat human beings as production inputs. He built an air force on systematic deception. He met impossible quotas by cutting corners that killed his own pilots. He maintained his position through bureaucratic warfare that paralyzed strategic decision-making. And when labor shortages threatened his production numbers, he enthusiastically embraced slavery and mass death. He was never a true believer. He wasn't driven by racial hatred or nationalist fervor. He was driven by ego, by the need to be indispensable, by the terror of being exposed as the fraud he always was. The tragedy is that he was competent in narrow ways. He could organize, he could administrate, he could push paper efficiently. But competence without morality is just efficient evil. Milch's story is a case study in how ordinary ambition becomes extraordinary atrocity, how bureaucracy becomes murder, how the desire to impress your superiors can lead to the deaths of thousands. He wasn't a monster from birth. He was a middle manager who discovered that ruthlessness was rewarded, that cruelty was efficient, that lies were easier than truth. And by the time he realized how far he'd fallen, he'd convinced himself he'd done nothing wrong. That's the real horror of Erhard Milch. Not that he was evil, but that he never thought he was. He died believing he was just a competent administrator who'd done his job well. And maybe that's the most terrifying thing of all. Thanks for watching.